Who are we? We represent the Australian Government as a part of the Department of the Environment and Energy. Our role is to represent the reviews of the Australian people through our government department to reverse the effects of climate change. The department is located in Canberra. This is functional for communications with other government agencies and for the progression of needed legislation. Furthermore, our divisions include the Antarctic Division, the Australian National Botanic Gardens, the Bureau of Meteorology, the Clean Energy Regulator, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority and the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust. The Minister for the Environment and Energy is currently the Honourable Josh Frydenberg. Our position on climate change is that we need to do better to improve our environment. However, this is not the easiest challenge. As a stakeholder, we have to put reform into place in an attempt to alter current and future circumstances. Our carbon neutral program was featured in the National Sustainability in Business Conference, the Green Cities Conference, and most recently, the Australasian Emissions Reduction Summit. It may be noted that climate change can negatively affect Australia's ecosystem and tourism industry, an example being the coral bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef due to warmer waters. It is planned that by 2020, our carbon emissions will be 5% below the levels of emissions from 2000 and will be easily met. Projections have now changed due to the closure of power stations, less emission from land clearance, and more effective energy use. By 2030, we plan to have carbon emissions reduced by 26% from the 2005 rate of emissions. However, issues surrounding our goals include our rising population and economic growth, along with other considerations such as transport and electricity needs. Although the negative effects of climate change could be worse if left uninhibited. Australia is a constitutional monarchy, meaning that it still comes under the banner of England. However, it is governed by the people under the Australian Constitution, which was proclaimed at Federation in January 1901. The efforts to reverse climate change is controlled by the Australian Government, which is currently the Liberal Party. It should be noted that the government does not have full control of legislation in Australia. The main lawmaking body within Australia is the legislature, or the Parliament. The Parliament consists of members who are voted by the people to represent their area and region. Members of Parliament belong to a party who represent policies and values of which they would like to align with, allowing the public to democratically choose who they would like to represent them. The party who wins the most seats in Parliament becomes the government until the next election. Responsible government is the concept that there is a chain of accountability from the Prime Minister to the public. The Prime Minister is responsible to the Cabinet and the Government, who is then responsible to the Parliament, who is then accountable to the public. This relates to climate change as our leadership can be challenged and criticised by all. The Minister for Environment and Energy is accountable to the Government, Parliament and public for decisions made and bill propositions put forward for consideration. They are also held accountable when preventable disasters occur related to energy and the environment. Australia is politically committed to improving our environmental state and has signed treaties bound by international law to change our environmental impact and carbon emissions. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change contains multiple events concerning the different aspects of improving our impact. The latest session is the Bonn Climate Change Conference in May 2017, which will discuss the implementation and provide further debate of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was created in 2016 and has so far been agreed to by 144 of the 197 countries which attended the UN Climate Change Conference in 2016. Australia has pledged into the cause, which extends the original convention.
Australia's contribution to the problems the world currently faces in climate change is immense. We are the largest exporter of coal and as a result are sending most of our emissions overseas. Our coal industry is worth 38 billion and our export volume has tripled since 1990, increasing our CO2 emissions by 253%. 73% of Australia's power is coal generated, making us the fifth largest coal power country behind Mongolia, South Africa, Poland and China. Australia's domestically emitted 560 million tonnes of CO2 in 2016, and emissions from Australian coal export was at 1 billion tonnes of CO2 in 2016 alone. Jennifer Morgan, Greenpeace International Executive Director, stated, "To be true to its commitments in the Paris Agreement, the Australian government needs to stop its support for the coal industry, invest in renewable energy and thus protect our natural wonders such as the Great Barrier Reef." With farming now occupying over half of Australia's landmass, Australia's farming and agricultural industry produces a large amount of emissions into the atmosphere. Emission types include carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane. 15% of Australia's emissions come from its farming and agriculture, 67.4% from cattle and sheep husbandry. Greenhouse gases produced by the agricultural sector make up 22% of our global emissions. Livestock production, including rearing, feeding and transportation, makes up just under 80% of the agricultural sector's emissions. By our own actions and the actions of other developed countries in the world, we have been instrumental in increasing global temperatures, occurrence of heat waves, and amount of natural disasters such as bushfires, droughts, and cyclones. Since 1910, Australia's average surface temperature has risen by 0.9 degrees Celsius, and without a doubt that number will rise over the century. Droughts are likely to increase, especially in southern Australia, which will in turn affect the price of goods such as food. Food prices are projected to increase by double the rate of the Consumer Price Index. Tropical cyclones have become more frequent and intense. However, in future they may become less frequent but much more powerful. The aftermath of these weather events will affect infrastructure, farming and agriculture, public health and our vast landscape. Australia has been instrumental in destroying our own coral reefs across our immense oceans due to climate change-induced bleaching. As ocean temperatures have risen and stayed at an elevated rate, 91% of individual reefs across the Great Barrier Reef have been affected in some way, with 67% in stages of mortality. Bleaching of coral reefs is unmanageable without the effects of climate change, with up to a 3 °C change in water temperature than the average temperature. Professor Justin Marshall, University of Queensland, stated that given the globally accepted link between carbon emissions, climate change and reef bleaching, the decision to improve the Carmichael coal mine in Queensland right next to the Great Barrier Reef really is adding insult to injury.
Changeable weather and temperature will affect crop yields and livestock production, which will lead to rising food prices and food shortages. The decline in weather availability and other changing conditions mean that farmers have to adapt agriculture production, and this will force prices up. Extreme weather like too much rainfall or not enough rainfall will result in storms, flooding, and droughts, which lead to decline in production. For example, wheat crops in southern Australia rely on winter-spring rainfall patterns that are already declining. Australia could become a net importer of wheat in future decades, which could drive up price of bread. To sum up, food supply in Australia is highly exposed to disruption from increasing extreme weather events driven by climate change. Prices are expected to increase as food production struggles to keep pace with the growing demands for commodities. Australians' health is also affected by climate change because extreme weather makes people more vulnerable to develop disease. In extreme hot weather, people such as sick, elderly, and people work outside are at risk of heat stress. Diseases such as gastroenteritis, Lyme, dengue, malaria, and kidney stones are all diseases which become more common with rising temperatures. Furthermore, dehydration, respiratory disease, and levels of pollen allergy also increase in hot temperature conditions. According to Australian Academy of Science, during the heat waves of early 2009 in Victoria, there were 374 more deaths than average for the time of year. Climate change can have impacts on infrastructure such as electricity, transport networks, power, and rail service. High use of air conditioning during hot weather will make the demand of electricity increase. In the 2009 heatwave in Melbourne, many rail services were cancelled because rails buckled and air conditioning failed. Climate change also affects the building materials and reduces the sustainability of infrastructure, which might potentially pose risks to people's safety. A small change in average temperature can make a big difference to our lives. Climate change will bring extreme weather such as heat waves, droughts, and floods. Studies show that there will be a lot more days over 35 degrees, which means that there will be more heat waves and more fires. Another effect of more hot weather, which is already being proved by scientific study, is drought and related water shortfalls. However, rain is likely to be more intense when it comes, which means that there will be more floods. The changing climate also results in ocean acidification, which is a change in ocean chemicals. In the long term, fish reproductive process will get affected significantly since fish eggs are more sensitive to pH changes than fish adults, and thus the pollution's number may gradually decrease. Another example of climate change impacts on people and the environment is the bleaching of the coral reef caused by increasing ocean temperature and CO2 levels. This is affecting the fish and fishing industry. Fishing on the Great Barrier Reef is an important industry for the Queensland and Australian economies. Lots of species of fish live in and around coral reefs. Species with low adaptability and mobility will face extinction.
With climate change becoming more of a global threat, Australia is affected from its agriculture and weather patterns to tourism and water supply. This creates a chain reaction. As a result of these effects, we are restricted to proceed further in our economy. From a geographical point of view, climate change has risen temperatures within Australia and as a result has decreased the survival for aquatic life. If nothing is done to reduce emissions being released into the atmosphere, inevitably corals and aquatic life forms will be destroyed or damaged. Not only through climate change is the natural occurrence of coral bleaching, but adding to its rapid decline is on human activity. Without the stabilisation of greenhouse gas concentrations, it seems inevitable that many of the world's coral reefs, not just Australia's, will become unsustainable habitats. They will cease to be coral reefs. As reefs decline, many of the millions of people who live near those reefs will lose critical sources of food, as well as coastal protection and tourism revenues. The persisting threat that continues to restrict recovery on the reef also deters tourists from visiting the country for its natural wonders and beautiful landscape. From climate change notably changing Australia from a geographical standpoint, it is also affecting its tourism and culture. Cultural heritage places were identified as likely to be impacted and accelerated by greenhouse gases and climate change. Numerous sites and historical buildings could potentially be impacted by climate change threats, such as climatic zone movements impacting cultural landscapes and gardens, increased temperatures, humidity, and coastal erosion. The most obvious risk factors for cultural heritage places are in coastal areas due to sea levels rising. Indigenous communities that live in remote areas are also affected as they heavily connect with the land and have been concerned with Australia's health for decades. While Indigenous communities have been able to adapt to climate change over thousands of years, in contrast, scientific findings suggest that future human-made climate change will occur more rapidly. Our economy is being restricted from climate change, mainly from our weather patterns becoming more severe. From droughts to floods, having snow and heat waves, the unpredictable weather is affecting Australia's resources and connections with other countries, particularly in agriculture. This is a huge industry within Australia, and many countries depend on us, as we depend on them, to export and import products. Many agricultural companies are learning the hard way in forms of adapting due to climate change. They involve options and responses to reduce vulnerability to climate risks. Transformational adaptation is difficult to understand since there are few studies of agricultural enterprises making transformative changes in response to climate change. This constrains producers to quickly adapt to climate change and leaves agricultural companies less informed about how to sustain from the impact of climate change and greenhouse gases. With weather and temperature playing a huge part in affecting the economy in terms of agriculture, our fresh produce and source of food to our natural water resources, climate change restricts an abundant supply of basic food and clean water. The Murray Bridge-Darling Basin is Australia's most important agricultural production area. It produces billions worth of agricultural products annually and accounts for around 40% of Australia's total agricultural production. Droughts have become a common weather pattern, and as it continues to lengthen, our source of water evaporates and food can no longer be grown and harvested. With flooding, on the other hand, which is another danger, to rivers and streams, they will overflow, as well as drown crops and possibly damage food for livestock.
Climate change appears to be increasing the intensity, frequency, and duration of extreme weather events. These effects have had immense impacts on population, health, and socio-economic development in many countries. Changes in rainfall patterns have led to increasing numbers of droughts and floods, causing crop yields to be far smaller than in previous years, forcing countries to import products from other countries. The world is experiencing increased air pollution and greater air, surface, and water temperatures, which has had an adverse effect on the health of the world's populace over the last 40 years. Climate change is and will continue to have catastrophic effects on nations all over the world, and actions must be taken swiftly to avoid further damage.
China has endorsed the UNFCCC and has issued their own nationally determined solutions. The nation aims at increasing its renewable energy share to 20% and decrease the carbon intensity of GDP by 60 to 65% of its 2005 level. Furthermore, China aims to increase forest volume by 4.5 billion meter cube, which will also play an important role in sustainable future for China. We stand proudly by China's agreements to enact change. However, we believe a national carbon trading policy would be a great benefit to China, as it will encourage the implementation of low carbon technologies and processes, while also providing economic growth and stability to a nation reaching the peak of their development.
The Philippines understand the threat they are under from climate change. As a tropical island nation, the Philippines are particularly susceptible to coastal hazards which result from climate change. Meteorological information highlights the increased intensity and frequency of rainfall, storm events, erosion, and rising sea levels. All of these hazards have the ability to damage socio-economic conditions and cause loss of life. The Philippines are taking both a defensive and attacking approach to climate change by utilising risk reduction strategies. They are continually in the process of developing and testing contingency plans, establishing emergency funds, and improving disaster awareness technologies to reduce the hazards of climate change. However, the Philippines are also taking their own aggressive approach to reduce their carbon footprint. In 2016, Olson's Renewable Energy Corporation, the AREC, have collected $650 million for the development of renewable energy infrastructure in the Philippines. $600 million of that will be dedicated to hydro energy, while the remainder will be devoted to solar energy. Australia supports the initiative the Philippines have taken towards mitigating climate change. It is an understandable approach that the tropical nation of the Philippines have focused on risk prevention strategies. However, by building renewable energy infrastructure, they are now taking a head-on approach to climate change, while actively reducing global emissions.
Unfortunately, the USA has reacted to climate change by focusing on an economic imperative, which has been partnered with political paralysis and reluctance to comply with the Kyoto Protocol. The nation has made little effort in climate change negotiations, and engagement has been minimal. The USA's transatlantic roles have become increasingly less clear in regards to mitigating climate change. Even though there are ETS present in some US states, they are now nowhere near the scale needed to nullify the country's emissions output. Environmentalists have been left searching for new approaches to improve low emissions technologies and systems. However, the campaigns are fragmented due to the country taking minimal action on any climate change commitments. Australia stands by the USA as a military ally, but we do not stand with USA with their approach to climate change. We believe their reliance on oil and gas is unsustainable and that they must begin to comply with the rest of the world. A global problem requires a global action, and the USA, as a large contributor to the problem, should be a part of this action.
India made a long-awaited announcement on the 2nd of October 2015. They were the last major economic powerhouse to make a pledge ahead of the United Nations climate talks in Paris. India is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet, meaning that cooperation of the nation is essential to resolving climate change issues. India has pledged to reduce its carbon intensity by cutting emissions per unit of gross domestic product from 35% to 33%. The country has vowed to produce around 40% of its energy from renewable or low carbon sources by 2030 and has agreed to undertake a reforestation process which would see the absorption of over 3 billion tonnes of CO2 by 2030. India says it will not place a cap on CO2 emissions during this process. However, Australia believes under an ETS, India would see the country's large emitters begin to adapt to low carbon processes. This would allow India to reach their renewable energy targets with less harm to the environment. Greenpeace is an independent global campaigning organisation which aims at changing attitudes and behaviours of people on an international scale through campaigning. They are present in 55 countries across Europe, America, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, with a mass of 2.8 million supporters. Their objective is to protect and conserve the environment and promote world peace. Climate change is a global problem, which they stress as an utmost threat to Earth. Greenpeace aims to catalyse an energy revolution and protects the world's forests in order to mitigate climate change. The objectives of Greenpeace align with a sustainable future. Greenpeace and organisations alike will act as powerful vehicles, compelling governments through debate, research, lobbying and diplomacy to reach what should be a common goal: preventing climate change from doing catastrophic, irreparable damage to Earth.
The aim of policy is to reform, direct and shape conscious human actions. Policies can be used to provide solutions for problems and can be aligned and implemented so that countries can contribute positively to a global objective. International policies encouraging the implementation of emissions trading systems, emissions taxes and technology programs would have a positive global effect in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The European Emissions Trading System, or EU ETS in short, has been at the forefront of CO2 reduction policies. It has successfully reduced carbon emissions in over 30 different countries. The EU ETS involves emitters trading permits in a fluid market to meet national CO2 emissions targets. Furthermore, the market is significant and involved the trading of over $1.6 billion worth of permits in 2012 alone. This emissions trading system was created after the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change formulated a set of treaties which aim to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and encourage sustainable economic development. This successful system has now been adopted and modified forms of the ETS are now operating in Quebec and many states in the USA. The success of ETS in Europe, US and Canada shows that ETS can have an immense positive effect in Australia and the rest of the world. The evidence of adoption proves that these systems can be melded to suit specific countries' needs and ideal outcomes. Additionally, ETS can encourage the building of new, low CO2 emitting processes and infrastructure. Another instance of policy being used as a solution for climate change is the Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Climate Agreement is an innovative new method for international climate governance. It is the first true global climate deal which commits all parties involved to reaching ambitious temperature goals by undertaking emissions reductions. There are 90 countries who have intended nationally determined contributions to the Paris Climate Agreement, which is a commitment to explicitly seek access to a form of international carbon market. This highlights the demand for global carbon markets around the world. China is looking to join this regime, and if the ETS is successful, it'll be twice as big as the EU ETS, the biggest ETS in the world. If the scheme is successful, it will potentially create incentive for other countries to implement carbon pricing policies and take climate action through carbon markets. If the scheme successfully operates in both Europe and China, Australian voters will have to seriously consider carbon markets as an ethical and logical solution to climate change. Policies are a crucial aspect of creating solutions to climate change, as they can be used to apply pressure to firms or large emitters of CO2. The World Bank has devised strategic approaches to promote climate mitigation activities for developing countries. Although it is not an active policy, it is a base on which developing countries' policies can be built. It includes methods to assemble global funds to compensate nations for expenses of low carbon developments and processes. It also aims at supporting technology research, diffusion and development to create greater opportunities for developing countries to resolve climate change. The main notion of the strategy is to pursue a win-win policy and invest in attractive, beneficial, economic and environmentally friendly processes which make domestic and global gains. Policies can be the driving force enacting change within the global community to provide a solution to the negative effect of climate change that we see today. Globalization has brought the world together both economically and socio-culturally in recent years. However, the global climate is something the world has always shared. The world is more connected now than ever before, making it a pivotal period of time which policies and agreements can be successfully implemented. It is imperative that we play a role in repairing the environmental situation that we have created. If we expect an oil company to clean up an oil spill they have caused, we must also expect the same of ourselves as individuals and governments to clean up the mess that we have created. It is a fundamental right and duty as stakeholders of the earth that we do this. If we as a global community sit idle in the face of a phenomenal and catastrophic event of climate change, our generation will be looked upon with contempt, and our descendants will tell of our generation's calamitous failure to take action when action was needed. It is not too late to reverse the effect and begin to build towards a sustainable future. With the UNFCCC, Paris Climate Agreement and the World Bank's policies and strategies mentioned, we now have the means to resolve this catastrophic issue before it is too late.
My country don't share no